Hi everyone, welcome to Circuit Skill Builders January topic lecture about the China natural resource topic. This will hopefully come in handy for you if you're competing at tournaments like ASU, Emory, or anything else that happens in January.
Great. So the resolution is resolved the People's Republic of China should substantially reduce its international extraction of natural resources. So going over a couple of important definitions. The first is international. This typically refers to of relating to or affecting two or more nations. Some people are making the argument, however, that China believes that regions like the South China Sea or Taiwan are its own, which they've made claims to. And since it is the actor in the resolution, they wouldn't reduce presence because, again, they perceive these regions as their own, which would make them domestic, not international. Another definition is extraction, which usually refers to the act or the process of directly extracting the materials from the earth or however these natural resources are obtained. And under this definition, imports do not fall under the scope of the resolution because in that China is not like involved in the act or process when it's typically importing materials. So that doesn't fall under this definition. And the actor of the resolution is the People's Republic of China. So now we're going to go over a couple of AF arguments.
Yeah. So the first half argument I think is an argument that is pretty good for lay judges, though it can work on the tech. It's about human rights. So China, for example, has been using mines across the entire world, whether that be in Myanmar, Africa, etc., and they typically utilize various degrees of human trafficking and oftentimes have low worker safety standards. But luckily, as you can probably induce, that the affirmative would require them to stop because they would no longer be allowed to do this human trafficking abroad. The impact can kind of just be like a pathos emotional appeal for lay judges, but it can also be coupled with soft left or structural violence framing to make it a viable argument on the tech. I'd also look into the BRI, so the Belt Road Initiative, which is how China has been kind of expanding not only mining, but also infrastructure projects broadly throughout other parts of the world. And it typically runs into these same issues. I believe this is a PF topic many years ago, so if you're able to look on the wiki or have back files, you can poke for those. There were definitely a lot of human rights implications on those topics. The next argument is about pollution. So this is also a very similar argument in that the affirmative would force China to stop something, to stop like resource extraction abroad, and resource extraction abroad has a negative impact. The negative impact here is pollution. That can oftentimes manifest in terms of air pollution, which obviously leads to health issues as well as people dying, but it can also be in ways we may not immediately think of. For example, water pollution or removing people from their homes in order to be able to start building mines, right? These are often things that like maybe we don't necessarily see right away. And you can probably read this on the tech as a structural violence impact coupled with the human rights argument above, but it's also persuasive on the lay when we just talk about like the local devastation and the emotional impact. I would say that you should probably be prepared to answer a common turn, which is how other actors would fill in and just take China's place, and maybe they'll be a little bit better for the environment, and the surrounding areas, or maybe they'll be worse. So I would look into A, which actors would be interested in filling in, and B, what potential impacts do we think that they will have on the environment?
Okay, so this next argument pertains to overfishing. The uniqueness is that China is driving fish stocks across the globe, particularly in West Africa and the South China Sea, to the brink of collapse, while also simultaneously engaging in skirmishes that risk escalating into conflict. And the latter is more prevalent in the South China Sea against countries like the Philippines, where it's using the boats to simultaneously like assert its dominance over territory so they can secure more fish. And the reason why they're doing this is because fish are such an essential source of food for their population, and it also makes them a lot of money while simultaneously enabling them to increase their influence. And so affirming would stop China's extraction of fish in the region, which kind of also reduces its incentive to be involved in the region, while also allowing stocks in the region to recover and decreasing regional tensions, since China has a lot less presence in the region, since a lot of that is made up of fishing boats. The latter is kind of more specific to the South China Sea, but just generally, it's pretty straightforward that by reducing China's extraction of fish, you allow local biodiversity and fish to replenish more and at a better rate than before. And so the impact to this is just that fish stocks collapsing risk regional biodiversity slash food security. And the skirmishes that I talked about above also have a risk of escalating into great power war. Because, for example, the Philippines has a mutual defense treaty with the US, where if invoked, it would get the US involved in the region as well. And that's kind of how you would get to great power war. So this is an argument that you can read with both a lay and a tech judge. Obviously, you probably want to avoid the great power war stuff for a lay judge, but I think it is a pretty good tech argument. And the only thing to be aware of is that if you specify the South China Sea in this argument, you should be prepared to answer this argument that China thinks it owns the South China Sea slash considers all of it like a domestic territory, because that would mean that affirming wouldn't reduce its extraction because it would not be considered international. This next argument is about rare earth minerals. The uniqueness is that China is dominating the rare earth mineral market and has like 80% of it worldwide, something around that. And that this dominance relies on foreign extraction in countries like Myanmar or in Africa as a whole, in specific regions like the DRC. And affirming cuts off China's access to all of this and means that China no longer has the ability to kind of stranglehold the US military slash economy, which is heavily dependent on rare earth minerals for a variety of technologies. And the internal link for this is that absent preventing China from being able to do that, they'll leverage these supply chains to coerce the US, and that emboldens them to go to war because they perceive themselves as being able to really easily take the US out of the equation by stopping their exports of those minerals. And the impact to that is just great power war. A couple of notes for this argument. I'm not really sure if the affirmative solves for the actual processing of the rare earth minerals, because even though it changes who extracts it, maybe, they still have to get sent to China to process them because China has such dominance over processing, and building new facilities takes a lot of time. And another thing is that there's a lot of articles about how China's control over rare earth minerals is overhyped and not absolute. So you should be prepared to answer that too. That's kind of like impact defense. This next argument is about Africa as a whole. The uniqueness is that China is giving regional actors like M23 arms to access natural resources in the region. So essentially, it's funding groups in the status quo so that it can engage in these operations. And so affirming would remove the incentive for China to actually give these arms in the first place because it can no longer extract in the region, which substantially decreases the amount of arms that groups have to commit conflict in the first place. And the impact for Lay would be that continued conflict kills slash displaces a lot of people. And the more technical impact is that this risks regional instability in Africa that draws in great powers who have vested interests in the region, like China. So a couple of notes for this argument. You should be prepared to answer the Africa dissent, which we'll explain later. And this is also a pretty straightforward argument, so it has a lot of potential on that. This next argument is about space. The uniqueness is that the US and China are increasingly competing in space to access resources, whether that's like, from asteroids or other planets. And so affirming, again, kind of similar to the fish argument, removes China's incentive to engage in the space race in the first place because it can no longer access these resources, which would make, which means that they have no interest in space anymore. And the impact to this is that this space race between the US and China is going to cause these escalation spirals in nuclear war. So, for the notes for this argument, some teams are arguing that space does not constitute international territory, which is a very silly argument because through treaties like the OST, it has been defined as international territory and multiple nations operate there. But you should be prepared to answer that argument regardless. And another common response that you should be prepared against is this idea that there are alternative reasons as to why China is militarizing space right now, for example, for great power status. Um, so this next argument is about deep sea mining. The uniqueness is that China is increasingly engaging in deep sea mining slash planning to engage in it in the future, as it's already secured a lot of rights to do so in the South China Sea. The affirmative assault for this by decreasing China's extraction, which is what deep sea mining is doing. And the impact to this is that deep sea mining harms the environment slash risk conflict with the US, who is also starting to engage in deep sea mining. You can make the argument that the sole reason as to why the US is trying to deep sea mine is because of China, but Trump probably wants to do deep sea mining regardless because he wants access to a lot of minerals slash a lot of companies in the US are pressuring him to do it. So this kind of makes solving for the environmental harms of deep sea mining a bit harder, but you can definitely still solve for the conflict scenarios since affirming would significantly reduce China's involvement in deep sea mining as a whole because it can no longer like extract to get these resources.
Okay. So the last AF argument we're going to talk about is the military. So you can get kind of creative with what the specific scenario on the uniqueness is. So it's usually China's military is strong or rising now, and it'll be used to do action, whether that's incite conflict with the United States, invade Taiwan, etc. The affirmative solves this because China's military relies on rare earth minerals, and as we've established previously, China relies on foreign resource extraction for the bulk of these rare earth minerals, whether that's be from Africa, Myanmar, etc. So logically, voting AF means China does not have the REMs necessary for its military forces. These REMs are used in a wide range of military technology, whether that be drone systems or new fighter jets, etc. The internal link will obviously depend on what specific uniqueness you go with in terms of the conflict that China's military will incite in the status quo. So, Taiwan conflict escalates, draws the United States. An attack on the US could escalate to nuclear conflict. Nuclear conflict, obviously bad. I think the biggest point of debate on this question, what is kind of, or biggest like question for this debate is how do we theorize around China? Is it offensive or is it defensive? You'll inevitably face a turn that says China declining is bad, it'll lash out, it'll cause conflict, which is something we'll talk about when we get to the negative. There's a lot of prominent scholars you can look into on this question. So, for example, Graham Allison talks about when rising powers collide with current hegemon that causes conflict. Michael Beckley talks about a conflict called peaking powers alongside of Hal Brands. Matthew Kronegg is also extremely prominent on this issue. So those are definitely just some scholars to give you a good starting point as to what the theorizations around China's intentions and whether or not it is defensive or offensive.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about some disadvantages on this topic. So the first is about the AI bubble. The uniqueness is that essentially this bubble has emerged in AI that will not pop now due to sustained improvements in the technology and increasing revenue. The link is that rare earth minerals are essential to AI because they're utilized in things like semiconductors and data centers that are necessary to forwarding the application of AI. And so, since affirming substantially decreases the supply of rare earth minerals, since China extracts most of them, there would be a huge shortfall in the materials necessary to actually create these things that are essential to AI, which would cause the bubble to pop because if you cannot like produce the things that are necessary to make AI happen, then AI cannot actually generate all of this like substantial revenue and it cannot be implemented further in the future. So it puts a huge constraint on AI's future potential. And the impact to this is that the AI bubble popping would cause mass economic decline similar to .com, which would throw people into poverty and cause war globally. So you need to cut a lot of uniqueness updates on this argument about whether or not the AI bubble will pop because articles come up on this pretty much every single day. An alternative route is just finding uniqueness that is somewhat close to the date of your tournament, and then saying that the qualifications of your authors slash the warrants that it has is much better than the ones that they have given, which I think is probably the more sustainable strategy here. And in general, the link is probably the best part of this argument because most people agree that the extraction of rare earth minerals depends on China right now. This next argument is pertaining to legitimacy. The uniqueness says that Xi Jinping or the CCP is perceived as legitimate in the status quo. And there are a couple of links to this argument. The first is that the affirmative would hurt domestic energy security because it relies on the extraction of foreign supplies, which angers people in China because it causes things like energy prices to go up. And the second link is that affirming would hurt China's ability to engage in economic coercion via rare earth minerals, which is important to the CCP's ability to combat Trump. For some context for this argument, Trump tried to institute huge tariffs on China a couple months ago, but they were ultimately rolled back because China implicated reciprocal tariffs slash put export controls on the rare earths that could be shipped to the US, which significantly constrained the US industrial base and caused Trump to back down from his tariffs. And that gave the CCP a lot of legitimacy that the affirmative would therefore produce. The internal link is that legitimacy shortfalls causes Xi to invade Taiwan. This is kind of what's known as the rally around the flag effect, where when you face a legitimacy shortfall, you try to, rally around your citizens around this idea of like nationalism and invade Taiwan to increase the regime's perceived like effectiveness and legitimacy. And the impact to this is that an invasion of Taiwan would cause great power drawn from powers like the US, who see Taiwan as essential for things like semiconductors and cause great power war. The internal link slash impact is the best part of this argument since there is a lot of evidence about this. The only problem is the link because it's not super explicit that these things are essential to regime legitimacy. And there's also a lot of evidence that says that the regime as a whole is very, very stable slash cannot be displaced due to its pretty much totalitarian tendencies. So you probably need to be prepared to answer that.
Okay, the next argument we're going to talk about is Lashout, and is kind of similar to the legitimacy argument that Tristan did talk about, but it's more specific and contextual to the military. So the uniqueness picture or the status quo is that China is currently a rising power. Its military is expanding in terms of not only its air power, but it's also naval power, and it's becoming increasingly effective. Like we talked about earlier, minerals are not only key to China's great power status, but it's also key to its military in forms of technology. I mentioned fighter jets and drones earlier, but there's also other things such as AI, which is increasingly playing a role on the battlefield. Declining power for China causes it to want to go to war. It lashes out. Specifically, it sees that it has all these ambitions in terms of becoming a great power, and it realizes that it now has a very short window of opportunity to do so. Its military is going to be stifled. It's no longer going to be able to just continuously have a stronger military than everyone. So they'll use their stronger military while it is still the strongest. As a result, that can cause conflict with the United States. It can cause an invasion of Taiwan, whatever China feels is necessary to legitimize its great power status and be that sole hegemon. I think the argument is relatively straightforward for the tech. The main problem might be the uniqueness, right? There's a lot of reasons as to why China might already perceive itself as a declining power, whether that's it's a demographic cliff after the one-child policy, they don't have a strong population, or there could be economic decline that's happening right now with a housing bubble that is constantly plaguing it. And again, it is really a question of is China revisionist or is it defensive? Beckley and Brands are probably the scholars that will support you most on this question, whereas Matthew Kronig is the author that will go against what you want to be reading when you're on the neg. So maybe look out for indicts on him. There's definitely a lot of literature that explicitly name drops him and says that he's wrong. The next argument is North Korea. The uniqueness picture is that China is currently investing in North Korea right now. They're doing joint investments for the sole reason of obtaining natural resources. However, the affirmative would force them to stop this investment because they can no longer do these natural resource extractions in North Korea since North Korea is obviously foreign relative to China. The internal link is interesting. It's usually about North Korea no longer having money. As a result, at least the state collapse, the Kim family might lose legitimacy. But I will say there's a lot of evidence that says the Kim regime is just very strong and can kind of suppress everyone. So this might be a little bit more of an uphill battle relative to other internal links. The impact is Kim, under this pressure, he might lash out, invade South Korea. If the regime truly were to collapse, chaos kind of devolves for North Korea. And in a world where there's nuclear weapons and we're unsure about who controls them, there definitely is a scenario for loose nuke scenarios that could draw in countries such as the US or China. I will say I think the best response to this argument is probably just saying like China already does a lot of trade with North Korea, so even if they're not doing the investment, the trade probably keeps North Korea's economy afloat. I've yet to see a good response to that, but who knows, maybe there is. Some people have made the argument about how China is getting oil from other countries and giving that oil to North Korea. The big question I had with this is I'm pretty sure China's oil extraction is largely domestic, but again, I could be wrong based on the evidence. For those of you who do choose to read this argument, I think there's a lot of good impact cards from the UN Security Council topic. I believe 2 years ago at the TOC, I know multiple teams read North Korea arguments with impacts about North Korean state collapse.
All right, so this next argument is about Africa. The uniqueness is that regional instability is on the brink right now. And there are a couple of links for this argument. The first is that the reason why instability is actually, kind of decreasing in the region right now is because China is helping to mediate a lot of conflicts in the region, i.e., between Thailand and Cambodia. And the argument here is essentially that the only reason why China is actually mediating in the first place is because it wants to maintain stability in the region so it can continue to access resources. And so, since they can no longer access those resources post affirmative, they have no incentive to do any mediation, and that allows conflict to resume in these regions. And the second link is that post affirmative, China will fund terrorist groups to get these resources, which would help empower them further, make them more money, and allow them to expand their operations. And the impact to this is just regional instability will draw in great powers, causing war, because there are a variety of them that are involved in the region. Um, for the notes for this argument, I would say that the second link is very, very questionable, but considering that this would basically just be China extracting by proxy, since it's just funding another actor and giving them the materials to do so. So this part might not be topical, but you can make claims going either way.
The next argument we're going to talk about is the argument about Russia. So the uniqueness is kind of similar to the North Korea argument, which is that China gets a lot of rare earth minerals from abroad, but not only does it keep those rare earth minerals to itself, it uses them to prop up its friends, not only North Korea, but also in this instance, Russia. Now, the impact of this can kind of go both ways, so it can also kind of be an AF argument, which is that if Russia doesn't have these rare earth minerals, whether it be its economy or its military, it is inevitably weakened and a lot less powerful. For the neg, the impact will look like Putin lashing out because he feels as if it's do or die for him in this last moment, or he might feel as because his conventional military is too weak, because we've already established that rare earth minerals are critical to conventional military forces, he might be forced to use his nuclear weapons in the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, such a nuclear use would be violent, bad, probably spills over to NATO and causes some sort of intervention from other nuclear armed powers such as France, the United Kingdom, or the United States. Again, I think the one thing you have to be really careful about is the impact turn, which is like, Putin winning the war in Ukraine, probably bad. Therefore, we should weaken his military so he can't win it. So I think that requires you to be prepared in terms of knowing A, who's winning on the ground in Ukraine in the status quo, so that can get you a better uniqueness picture. But similar like we talked about with China, scholars debate as to whether or not Ukraine or Russia will want to expand past Ukraine, or whether or not they feel as if they need to, re-reach that state of the Soviet Union. Those are all questions that are up for debate, and I think those are valuable questions to explore in order to hedge against the impactor. Next argument we're going to talk about is the economy. So the uniqueness is that China's economy is relatively stable now, or you can say that it's on the brink, or you can even say that it's increasing as we speak. However, rare earth minerals are really key to China's economy because they power a lot of different sectors of it. For example, artificial intelligence, computer chips, green tech, all of these things that are massively important to not only China's economy, but really the economies of a lot of modern countries. The internal link is that the economy is decked, and the impact for a more lay-oriented debate could be talking about poverty or lower standards of living. But as Tristan talked about earlier, when a leader faces a legitimacy crisis, which happens when people are unhappy due to the fact that the economy is not strong, she may opt to start a conflict in Taiwan so people stop paying attention to the price of eggs at home and start looking to this conflict abroad. I think the weakest part of this argument is the uniqueness. China's economy, yes, is stable now, but there are plenty of future events that also threaten to deck China's economy, which would make this argument non-unique. So, for example, there's a housing bubble that is threatening to destabilize China's economy, so be prepared to frontline all of these non-uniques. The last argument we're going to talk about is about climate change. So, the unique picture says that China is a global leader in green tech. It's building electric vehicles, solar panels, etc. All these things that reduce CO2 emissions and are generally good for the environment. Though there are some cards that do say the opposite, and that's an interesting debate to have. The link is that we've already established China is reliant on countries abroad for rare earth minerals, whether that be from Africa, Myanmar, etc. And if they don't have the rare earth minerals, then they can't build green tech because one of the most important components of green tech for any country is having rare earth minerals. The internal link is that having this green tech can not only be used in China, but can be used globally, which would solve more. This is probably supercharged by the US slacking off, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, things like that that make China all the more important now. The impact can be more light oriented and just saying like climate change causes air pollution, kills people, which in of itself is an impact, but it can also cause extinction through things such as feedback loops, resource wars that go nuclear. A lot of good scholars on this issue. Um, Last year the TOC topic was about nuclear energy, and there are plenty of climate change impacts there. So if you need help finding one, you can definitely look to the wiki from last year. I will say that the internal link is probably the weakest part of this argument, since climate change isn't really being solved in the status quo, and seeing as you're the negative, you defend the status quo. In a similar vein, you need cards that say we aren't already past the irreversible brink, right? Because most of these climate change technologies, they can't really pull emissions out of the air, though some do. They mostly just reduce emissions being produced. So if we're already past the brink, it would be too late, and the status quo clearly isn't solving.
And that's it. Thanks for watching.